"Do you know, Kostya, whom Sergey Ivanovitch found on the train?" said Dolly, after she had given her children their cucumbers and honey. "Vronsky. He's going to Serbia." "Yes, and not alone either. He's taking out a squadron of cavalry at his own expense," said Katavasov. "That's like him," answered Levin. "But are volunteers still going off?" he added, looking at Sergey Ivanovitch. Sergey Ivanovitch was busy with a knife blade rescuing a live bee from the honey that had flowed out of the white honeycomb at the bottom of his cup, and he did not answer. "Indeed, I should say so," said Katavasov, biting into a cucumber. "If you had only seen them at the station this morning! Now, what an idea this is! For Christ's sake, tell me, Sergey Ivanovitch, where all these volunteers are going, and whom they are going to fight with?" asked the old prince, evidently pursuing a conversation which they had begun before Levin joined them. "With the Turks," answered Sergey Ivanovitch, smiling quietly, as he at last rescued the helpless honey-smeared bee on the point of his knife and set him on an aspen leaf. "But who has declared war on the Turks? Is it Ivan Ivanovitch Ragozov, and the Countess Lydia Ivanovna, and Madame Stahl?" "No one has declared war, but people sympathize with their oppressed brethren and want to help them," said Sergey Ivanovitch. "The prince was not speaking here of help, but of war," said Levin, coming to the assistance of his father-in-law. "The prince means that private persons have no right to take part in a war without being authorized by the government." "Kostya, look out! There's a bee. Won't he sting?" cried Dolly, defending herself from a wasp. "That's not a bee, that's a wasp," said Levin. "Come now, give us your theory," demanded Katavasov, evidently provoking Levin into a discussion. "Why shouldn't private persons have that right?" "Well, my theory is this. War, on the one hand, is such a terrible, such an atrocious thing, that no man, at least no Christian man, has the right to assume the responsibility of beginning it, but it belongs to government alone when it becomes inevitable. On the other hand, both in law and in common sense, where there are state questions, and above all matters concerning war, private citizens have no right to use their own wills." Sergey Ivanovitch and Katavasov were both ready at the same instant with answers. "That's where you're mistaken, Bayushka," said Katavasov. "There may be cases when government does not carry out the will of its citizens, and then society declares its own will." But Sergey Ivanovitch did not approve of this reply. He frowned as Katavasov spoke, and put it another way. "You state the question all wrong. Here there is no declaration of war, but simply an expression of human, of Christian sympathy. Our brethren, men of the same blood, the same faith, are butchered. Now, we do not merely regard them as brethren, and as co-religionists, but as women, children, old men. Our feelings are stirred, and the whole Russian people fly to help check these horrors. Suppose you were walking in the street and saw a drunken man beating a woman or a child. I think you would not stop to ask whether war had been declared or had not been declared on such a man before you attacked him and protected the object of his fury." "No, but I should not kill him." "Yes, you might even kill him." "I don't know. If I saw such a sight, I might yield to the immediate feeling. I cannot tell how it would be. But in the oppression of the Slavs, there is not, and cannot be, such a powerful motive." "Perhaps not for you, but other people think differently," said Sergey Ivanovitch angrily. "The people still keep the tradition of sympathy with brethren of the Orthodox faith who are groaning under the yoke of the unspeakable Turk. They have heard of their terrible sufferings and are aroused." "That may be," answered Levin in a conciliatory tone. "Only I don't see it. I myself am one of the people, and I don't feel it." "I can say the same," put in the old prince. "I was living abroad. I read the newspapers, and I learned about the Bulgarian atrocities, but I could never understand why all Russia took such a sudden fancy for their Slavic brethren. I am sure I never felt the slightest love for them. I was greatly ashamed. I thought I must either be a monster, or that Carlsbad had a bad effect on me. But since I have come back, I don't feel stirred at all, and I find that I am not the only one who is not so much interested in the Slav brethren as in Russia. Here is Konstantin." "Private opinions are of no consequence. There's no meaning in private opinions, when all Russia, when the whole people, signified what they wished," said Sergey Ivanovitch. "Yes, excuse me, I don't see this. The people don't know anything," said the prince. "But papa, how about Sunday in church?" said Dolly, who had been listening to the conversation. "Give me a towel, please," she said in an aside to the old beekeeper, who was looking at the children with a friendly smile. "It can't be that all—" "Well, what about Sunday at church? They tell the priest to read a prayer. He reads it. Nobody understands one word. They snore just as they do during the whole sermon," continued the prince. "Then they tell them that the salvation of their souls is in question. They pull out their kopecks and give them. But why they have not the least idea." "The people cannot know their destiny. They have an instinctive feeling, and at times like this they show it," said Sergey Ivanovitch, looking at the old beekeeper. The handsome, tall old man, with his black beard, wherein a few gray hairs were beginning to show, and with his thick, silvery hair, stood motionless, holding a cup of honey in his hand, looking at the gentleman with a mild, placid air, evidently not understanding a word of the conversation, nor caring to understand. He nodded his head with deliberation as he heard Sergey Ivanovitch's words, and said, "That's certainly so." "Well now, ask him about it," said Levin. "He doesn't know. He doesn't think. Have you heard about the war, Mikhailovitch?" asked he of the old man. "You know what was read in Sunday at church, don't you? What do you think? Ought we to fight for the Christians?" "Why should we think? Our Emperor Alexander Nikolaevich will think for us, as in everything else. He knows what to do. Should you like some more bread? Shall I give some to the little lad?" asked he, turning to Darya Alexandrovna and pointing to Grisha, who was munching a crust. "What's the use of asking him?" said Sergey Ivanovitch. "We have seen, and still see, hundreds and hundreds of men abandoning all they possess, giving their last penny, enlisting and trooping from every corner of Russia, all clearly and definitely expressing their thought and purpose. What does that signify?" "It signifies, in my opinion," said Levin, beginning to get excited, "that out of 80 millions of men there will always be found hundreds, and even thousands, who have lost their social position, are restless, and are ready to take up the first adventure that comes along, whether it is to follow Pugatchov, or to go to Khiva, or to fight in Serbia." "I tell you they are not adventurers who devote themselves to this work, but they are the best representatives of the nation," cried Sergey Ivanovitch, excitedly, as if he were defending his last position. "There are the contributions. Isn't that a test of popular feeling?" "The word people is so vague," said Levin. "Long-haired scribblers, professors, and perhaps 1 in 1,000 among the peasants understand what it is all about. But the rest of the 80 millions do as Mikhailovitch here does. They not only don't express their will, but they haven't the slightest idea that they have any will to express. What right, then, have we to say that this is the will of the people?" Sergey Ivanovitch was skilled in dialectics, and without replying he took up another side of the question. "Yes, if you want to get at the mind of the nation by an arithmetical process, of course it will be very hard work. We have not the proper gifts, and cannot reckon it that way. But there are other means of learning it besides arithmetic. It is felt in the air, it is felt in the heart, not to speak of those submarine currents which flow through the stagnant ocean of the people and which are evident to every unprejudiced person. Take society in a narrower sense. Take the intelligent classes, and see how on this point even the most hostile parties combine. There is no longer a difference of opinions. All the organs of society express the same thing. They have all become aware of an elemental force which fills the nation with its own motive power." "Yes, the newspapers all say the same thing, that is true," said the old prince. "But then, so do all the frogs croak before a storm. That doesn't signify much." "Whether frogs or not, I don't edit newspapers, and I don't set up to defend them. I am talking of the unanimity of opinion among intelligent people," said Sergey Ivanovitch, turning to his brother. Levin was about to reply, but the old prince took the words from his mouth. "Well, something else may be said in regard to that unanimity. Here is my son-in-law, Stepan Arkadyevitch, you know. He has just been appointed a member of some commission or other, I don't know what, with a salary of 8,000 a year, and nothing to do. Now, Dolly, that's not a secret. Ask him if his office is useful. He will tell you that it is indispensable. And he is an upright man, but you could not make him cease to believe in his full 8,000 salary." "Oh, yes, he told me to tell Darya Alexandrovna that he had got that place," said Sergey Ivanovitch, angrily, considering that the prince's remark was not apropos. "Of course the newspapers are unanimous. That is easily explained. War will double their circulation. How can they help supporting the Slavic question and the national instinct?" "I don't like many of the papers, but you are unjust," said Sergey Ivanovitch. "I will only add one more suggestion," said the old prince. "Alphonse Karr wrote a clever thing just before the Franco-Prussian War, when he said, 'You say this war is absolutely necessary? Very good. Go to the front then, and be under the first fire, and lead the first onslaught.'" "Good editors would be glad to do that," said Katavasov, with a loud laugh, and trying to imagine certain editorial friends of his in this chosen legion. "Yes, but when they ran away," said Dolly, "they'd bother the others." "Just as soon as they begin to run, put in veterans behind them, or some Cossacks with whips," said the prince. "Well, that's a joke, but not a very good joke. Excuse me, prince," said Sergey Ivanovitch. "I don't think it was a joke," said Levin. "It was—" But his brother interrupted him. "Every member of society is called upon to do his duty," said he, "and thoughtful men perform theirs by giving expression to public opinion, and the unanimous and full expression of public opinion is creditable to the press, and at the same time a good symptom. 20 years ago we should have kept quiet. Today we hear the voice of the Russian people, which is ready to rise like one man, and ready to sacrifice itself for its oppressed brethren. It is a great step taken, a proof of power." "Yes, not only to avenge their brethren, but to kill the Turks," said Levin timidly. "The people will sacrifice itself, and be ready to sacrifice itself for the salvation of their souls, but not for murder," he added, involuntarily connecting this conversation with the thoughts of the morning. "What do you mean by soul? That, to a naturalist, you must remember is a very puzzling expression. What is the soul?" demanded Katavasov with a smile. "Oh, you know." "'Pon my word, I haven't the least idea." And the professor broke into a burst of laughter. "Christ said, 'I am not come to bring peace, but a sword,'" remarked Sergey Ivanovitch, quoting as simply as if it were something comprehensible a passage from the Gospel which had always troubled Levin. "That's just so," replied the old beekeeper, who had been standing near them, in response to a chance look directed to him. "Come, Batyushka, you're beaten, wholly beaten!" cried Katavasov gaily. Levin reddened with vexation, not because he was beaten, but because he had been drawn into discussion again. "No, it is impossible for me to dispute with them," he thought. "Their armor is impenetrable, and I am defenseless." He saw that he could not defeat his brother and Katavasov, and it was equally impossible to agree with them. Their arguments were the fruit of that same pride of the intellect which had almost ruined him. He could not admit that a handful of men, his brother among them, had the right, on the ground of what was told them by a few hundred eloquent volunteers who came to the capital, to claim that they and the newspapers expressed the will and sentiment of the people, especially when this sentiment expressed itself in vengeance and butchery. He could not agree with this because he did not discover the expression of these thoughts among the people in whose midst he lived, and he did not find them in himself, and he could not consider himself as anything else than one of the men constituting the Russian nation, but principally because he did not, any more than the rest of men, know, nor could he know, what constituted the general good, but he firmly believed that the attainment of this general good was brought about only by the strenuous fulfillment of that law of right which is revealed to everyone, and therefore he could not desire war, or preach it as a means of attaining any general end whatever. He and Mikhailovitch, and the people in general, expressed themselves in somewhat the same language as was used when the early Russians invited the Varyags to come from Scandinavia. Come and rule over us. We gladly promise absolute submission. We are enduring all trials, all humiliations, all sacrifices, but we do not judge and we do not decide. And now, according to Sergey Ivanovitch, the people were ready to turn their backs on a right which they had purchased at such a price. He wanted to say in addition that if the general opinion is an infallible judge, then why should not the revolution, the commune, be as useful to the Slavs as lawful means? But all these were thoughts which could not decide anything. The only thing that he could clearly see was that at the present moment the discussion was exasperating to Sergey Ivanovitch, and therefore it was wrong to discuss it. So Levin held his peace and turned the attention of his guests to the clouds that were rolling up, and he advised them to hurry home if they did not want to get wet. The prince and Sergey Ivanovitch seated themselves in the cart and drove on. The rest of the party, quickening their steps, started back on foot. But the thunderstorm, white on top, black underneath, came up so rapidly that they had to hurry so as to reach the house before the rain was on them. The clouds coming on as the vanguard, hung low, were as black as soot, and drove across the sky with extraordinary rapidity. They had reached within 200 feet of the house, and already the wind had begun to rise, and the downpour might be expected at any second. The children ran on ahead, laughing and screaming with delight and terror. Darya Alexandrovna, struggling with her skirts, which the wind blew round her legs, no longer walked, but ran, not letting the children out of her sight. The gentlemen, holding on their hats with difficulty, walked with long strides. They had just reached the porch when the great drops began to strike and splash against the edge of the iron gutter. The children, and just behind them their elders, with gay exclamations, ran under the shelter of the porch. "Where's Katerina Alexandrovna?" asked Levin of Agafya Mikhailovna, who was coming out of the door, loaded with shawls and plaids. "We supposed she was with you." "And Mitya?" "He must be in the Kolak woods with his nurse." Levin seized the plaids and started for Kolak. In the few minutes that had elapsed, the storm had reached beyond the sun, and it was as dark as if there was an eclipse. The wind blew obstinately, as if insisting on its own way, tried to stop Levin, and, tearing off the leaves and flowers from the lindens, and rudely and strangely bearing the white branches of the birches, bent everything to one side: acacias, flowers, burdocks, the grass, and the tree-tops. The girls working in the garden ran squealing under the shelter of the servants' quarters. The white screen of the pouring rain had already cut off the distant forest and half of the adjacent field, and was rapidly advancing on Kolak. The dampness of the shower was felt in the atmosphere like fine drops. Bending his head and fighting vigorously against the gale, which tugged at his shawls, Levin was already on his way to Kolak. He thought he already saw white forms behind a well-known oak, when suddenly a glare of light seemed to burst from the ground before him, and the vault of the sky above him fall with a crash. When he opened his dazzled eyes, he looked through the thick curtain formed by the rain, which cut him off from the Kolak woods, and saw, to his horror, that the green top of a well-known oak which stood in the forest had strangely changed its position. Even before he could ask, "Can the lightning have struck it?" he saw it bending over more and more rapidly, and then disappeared behind the other trees, and he heard the crash the great oak made as it fell, carrying with it the neighboring trees. The glare of the lightning, the crash of the thunder, and the sensation of chill running over his whole body blended for Levin in one impression of horror. My God, keep them safe!" he exclaimed. And though he instantly felt the absurdity of the prayer, since the oak had already fallen, he nevertheless said it over and over, for he knew that, absurd as it was, he could not do anything else to help them. He hastened toward the spot where they generally went, but he did not find them. They were in another part of the woods under an old linden, and they called to him. 2 figures dressed in dark clothes, they usually wore white, were bending over something under the trees. It was Kitty and the nurse. The rain had stopped, and it was beginning to grow lighter when Levin reached them. The bottom of the nurse's dress was dry, but Kitty's gown was wet through and clung to her. Though it was no longer raining, they were standing just as they had been when the shower began. Both were leaning over the baby carriage with its green parasol. "Alive! Safe! God be praised!" he cried, as, splashing through the puddles, he ran to them with his shoes full of water. Kitty's glowing face, all wet, was turned to him, and she smiled timidly from under her hat, which had lost its shape in the rain. "There now, aren't you ashamed? I can't understand how you could do such a careless thing," he began in his vexation, scolding his wife. "Goodness, it was not my fault. We were just starting to go when he began to be restless. We had to change him. We were just," Kitty said, trying to defend herself. Mitya was safe, dry, and still soundly sleeping. "Well, God be thanked. I don't know what I'm saying." They hastily picked up the wet diapers. The nurse took the baby, and Levin, ashamed of his vexation, gave his arm to his wife, and led her away, pressing her hand gently. In the course of all that day, during the most varied conversations in which Levin took part, as it were, only with the external side of his mind, and notwithstanding his disillusion at finding that the moral regeneration had not taken place in his nature after all, he did not cease to be pleasantly conscious that his heart was full. After the shower, it was too wet to go out for a walk, and, moreover, other threatening clouds were piling up on the horizon, and here and there reaching up high into the sky, black and laden with thunder. All the household spent the rest of the day within doors. Discussions were avoided, and after dinner all were in the gayest frame of mind. Katavasov at first kept the ladies laughing by his original turns of wit, which always pleased people when they made his acquaintance. Then afterward, being drawn out by Sergey Ivanovitch, he related his very interesting observations on the different characteristics and features of male and female flies, and their habits. Sergey Ivanovitch also was very gay, and at tea he explained the future of the Eastern question so simply and well that all could follow him. Kitty alone did not hear him. She had been summoned to the nursery to give Mitya his bath. A few moments after Kitty had left the room, Levin also was called to follow her. Leaving his tea, and feeling regretful at having an interesting conversation interrupted, and at the same time troubled because they had called him to the nursery, a thing which had hitherto happened only in cases of emergency, Levin followed his wife. In spite of the fact that he was greatly interested in his brother's partly outlined scheme of making the newly enfranchised world of 40 million Slavs join with Russia in establishing a new epoch in history, for it was something entirely novel to him, in spite of his curiosity and anxiety at having been summoned to the nursery, as soon as he had left the drawing-room and was once more alone, he immediately remembered his thoughts of the morning. And all these theories as to the significance of the Slav element in the universal history seemed to him so insignificant in comparison with what was taking place in his own soul, that for a moment he forgot all about it, and returned to the moral state that had so delighted him at the beginning of the day. This time he did not wholly retrace the course of thought which had led him to this state of mind, nor was it necessary. He was borne immediately back to that feeling which had guided him, which had been connected with those thoughts, and he now found the feeling stronger and more definite in his soul than ever before. Now there was no longer what had always marked his previous imaginary attempts at gaining spiritual calmness, when he had been obliged to call a halt to the whole course of his thoughts in order to find the feeling. Now, on the contrary, the feeling of joy and calmness was more vivid than before, but thought did not overtake the feeling. He walked along the terrace and saw 2 stars glowing in the already darkening sky, and suddenly he remembered a course of reasoning. "Yes," he said to himself, "as I looked at the heavens I thought that the vault which I gaze at is not a lie. But there was something that remained half thought out in my mind, something that I hid from myself. Now, what was it? There cannot be an answer. If one could think it out, all things would be explained." Just as he entered the child's chamber, he remembered what it was that he hid from himself. It was this: "If the chief proof of the existence of God lies in the revelation of good,
Why should this revelation be limited to the Christian Church? How about those millions of Buddhists and Mohammedans who are also seeking for the truth and doing right? It seemed to him that there must be an answer to this question, but he could not find and express it before entering the room. Kitty, with her sleeves rolled up, was bending over the bathtub in which she was washing the baby. As she heard her husband's steps, she turned her face to him, and with a smile called him to her. With one hand she was supporting the head of the plump little fellow, who was floating on his back in the water and kicking with his legs. With the other she was squeezing the sponge on him. "Come here. Look, look," she said as her husband came up to her. "Agafya Mikhailovna is right. He knows us." The fact was that Mitya today for the first time gave indubitable proof that he knew his friends. As soon as Levin went to the bathtub, the experiment was tried, and it was wholly successful. A cook, who was called for the purpose, bent over the tub. The baby frowned and shook his head. Kitty bent over him, and he smiled radiantly and clung with his little hands to the sponge and sucked with his lips, producing such a strange and contented sound that not only the mother and nurse, but Levin himself, were enchanted. They took the baby from the water, wiped him, and after he had expressed his disapprobation with a piercing scream, they gave him to his mother. "Well, I am very glad to see that you begin to love him," said Kitty, as she sat down in a comfortable seat with the child at her breast. "I am very glad. It really troubled me when you said you hadn't any feelings for him." No. Did I say that I had no feeling for him? I only said that I was disappointed.
"How are you disappointed?"
I wasn't disappointed in him, but in the feeling that he would arouse. I expected more. I expected as a surprise some new and pleasant feeling, and instead of that it was pity, disgust.
She listened to him as she put on her slender fingers the rings which she had taken off while bathing the baby.
And more of fear and pity than of satisfaction. I never knew until today, after the storm, how much I loved him.
Kitty smiled with radiant joy. "Were you very much afraid?" she asked. "And so was I. But it seems more terrible to me now when the danger is all past. I shall go and look at the oak tomorrow. How nice Katavasov is! Well, the whole day has been so pleasant. You are so delightful with your brother when you want to be. Well, go to them. It is always hot and stifling in here after the bath." Levin, on leaving the nursery and finding himself alone, began to follow out his line of thought, in which there had been something obscure. Instead of going back to the drawing-room, where he heard the sound of voices, he remained on the terrace, and, leaning over the balustrade of the terrace, he looked at the sky. It had grown very dark, and there was not a cloud in the south where he was looking. The clouds were all in the opposite quarter. From time to time it would lighten, and the distant thunder would be heard. Levin listened to the drops of rain falling rhythmically from the lindens, and looked at the stars and then at the Milky Way. Whenever the lightning flashed, then not only the Milky Way but also the bright stars would disappear from his vision, but by the time the thunder sounded they would reappear in their places, as if a careful hand had readjusted them in the firmament.
Well, now what is it that troubles me? Levin asked himself, already beginning to feel that a resolution of his doubts, though it had not yet become a matter of knowledge, was ready in his soul. Yes, there is one evident, indubitable manifestation of the divinity, and that is the laws of right which are made known to the world through revelation, and of which I am conscious as existing in myself, and in the recognition of them I am, in spite of myself, willingly or unwillingly, united with other men into one brotherhood of believers, which is called the Church. Yes, but are Hebrews, Confucians, Mohammedans, Buddhists, in the same relation? He asked himself, recurring to the dilemma which had seemed so portentous to him. Can these hundreds of millions of men be deprived of the greatest of blessings, of that which alone gives a meaning to life? He paused, but immediately recovered his train of thought. What am I asking myself? I am questioning the revelation of the various forms of human belief to divinity. I am questioning the revelation of God to the whole universe with all its nebulae. But what am I doing? And at the moment when knowledge, sure though inaccessible to reason, is revealed to me, shall I still persist in dragging in logic? Do I not know that the stars do not move?" said he, noticing the change that had taken place in the position of the brilliant planet which he had seen rising over the birches. But, seeing the stars change place, and not being able to imagine the revolution of the earth, then I should be right in saying that they moved. Could the astronomers have made any calculations and gained any knowledge if they had taken into consideration the varied and complicated motions of the earth? Have not their marvelous conclusions as to the distances, the weight, the motions, and revolutions of the celestial bodies all been based on the apparent movements of the stars around a motionless earth? These very movements which I now witness, as millions of men for centuries have witnessed them, and which can always be verified. And just as the conclusion of the astronomers would have been inaccurate and false if they had not been based on their observations of the heavens, such as they appeared relatively to a single meridian and a single horizon, so all my conclusions as to the knowledge of good and evil would be inaccurate and false if they were not founded on that comprehension of good and evil which for all men always has been and always will be one and the same, and which Christianity has revealed to me and which my soul can always verify. The relations of human belief to God must, for me, remain unfathomable. To search them out belongs not to me." "Haven't you gone in yet?" said Kitty's voice suddenly. She was on her way to the drawing room, by the way of the terrace. "There's nothing that troubles you, is there?" she asked, looking wistfully up into her husband's face, and trying to study its expression by the starlight. By the light of a flash of lightning on the horizon, she saw that he was calm and happy, and she smiled. "She understands me," thought he. "She knows what I am thinking. Shall I tell her or not? Yes, I will tell her."
But just as he was about to speak, Kitty broke in. "Kostya," said she, "do be so kind and go to the corner room and see how they have arranged for Sergey Ivanovitch." "I don't like to. See if they put in the new washstand properly."
"Certainly. I'll go," answered Levin, rising and kissing her. "No, better be silent," thought he as she went past. "The secret has no importance save for me alone, and words could not explain it. This new feeling has neither changed me, nor suddenly enlightened me, nor made me happy, as I imagined it would. It is just like my feeling for my son. There is no element of surprise in it. But it is faith. No, not faith. I know not what it is. But the feeling stole into my soul through suffering, and there it is firmly established. I shall continue to be vexed with Ivan the coachman, and get into useless discussions, and express my thoughts blunderingly. I shall always be blaming my wife for what annoys me, and repenting at once. I shall always find a certain barrier between the holy of holies of my inmost soul and the souls of others, even my wife's. I shall continue to pray without being able to explain to myself why. But my whole life, every moment of my life, independently of whatever may happen to me, will be, not meaningless as before, but full of the deep meaning which I shall have the power to impress upon it.
End of chapter 19 and end of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy.